Hello, I'm Amber Hardman and welcome to this week's episode of NatChat. Today I'm joined by an Australian actor, Richard Norton. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you, Amber. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. You've come in today to talk a little bit about your career and also a new movie that that is being released on DVD soon. How exactly did you get into acting in the first place?
It's been a long journey, Amber, but it started through, the movie career actually started through meeting Chuck Norris. I grew up in Croydon, Melbourne suburb. Ended up, or started straight after school working in the immigration department of all things, doing interviewing. And I had started martial arts training when I was 12 years of age. That was always my passion and still always is. And when I was a teenager, I ended up becoming chief instructor in Zendokai, which is a string of karate schools with partner Bob Jones. And we were doing some tournaments and Bob decided to bring Chuck Norris out to Australia. And I was demonstrating on the same card with weapons and everything else. Anyway, Chuck and I met and became instant friends.
Wow.
And I ended up in California in 1979 doing personal bodyguard work for, rock and roll bands, Linda Ronstadt being the person that invited me out. I rang Chuck Norris up because I wanted to train with him.
Yeah.
And that was it. He was in pre-production for one of his earlier movies called The Octagon. He knew I could handle weapons. There was some great roles in there. And so that was the beginning of a movie career.
Very exciting. So it started off with Chuck Norris, and you had some maybe smaller parts in those movies in action scenes.
Yeah, action scenes. I always say in Octagon, my claim to fame was I died 8 times because that was one of the first films featuring ninja. So there was 4 of us that did all the stunt work. We had masks on, and we did different action scenes. And there was one role where you could see who I was, and there was the main bad role where I had a red sort of headdress on, and technically I was supposed to be Asian, so nobody really knew who I was in that sense. But it was an introduction, and it was fascinating, and I ended up doing some more roles with Chuck in some of his other movies. Did something like 15 guest roles in Walker, Texas Ranger, which was a very successful series that Chuck had going for nearly 8 years. And it's all about networking in the entertainment business, and through the people I met through working with Chuck, I ended up branching out on my own, and it's something like 65 movies now I've been lucky enough to work in different parts of different countries.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And we're still going.
Wow. So how long were you based in the United States for before you came back to Australia?
Well, I'm still based there.
Yeah.
My wife and I, Judy, we're still there. I left there, as I said, in 1979. So it's been, nigh on 30 years now that I've lived there. But we have a home in South Melbourne. And I always say LA's work home and South Melbourne, and this, Australia is home. We both have family here. But predominantly it's been over in the States, and it still is. We're only now just deciding we want to be in Australia a lot more than we are in America because, as I say, it's been a long time away.
Yeah.
It's always, though, up to economics. You go where the work is, and that's been a predominant reason for being over in the US.
Now, you said that you've made 65 movies. Has that all been, in a martial arts capacity, or has some of the movies been more acting, less martial arts, or?
Yeah, no, look, they're predominantly action-based films. As I said, there's something, Judy and I both believe in: what you think about most, you attract. For me, what I think about most of the time is my martial arts. It's my passion, and everything good that's ever happened to me in my life has come as a result of that. As a result, the roles, my real strength is action, doing fight scenes, whether it's stunt coordinating, fight coordinating, or acting in front of the camera. So I would say probably good 90% of the films have been based on action. But, along the way, you still have a dramatic role to fulfill. It's no longer the idea where you just fight and don't say anything. You've got to be able to develop a character and really flesh a character out. And there's been some comedies. I did a few comedies over there. One was called Mind Games, where I played kind of like a southern cowboy who's really an Australian, but part of his con is that he sort of takes on this southern persona. And that was a trip because, I had about 2 lessons on taking on a southern accent.
How'd you go?
Well, you know, it was all right. I mean, luckily the character's not supposed to be authentic Southern character, otherwise, you know, would have blown me out of the water. But again, it was a challenge that was fun. And actually a Southern accent is probably the easiest for Australians to take on, because they tend to drop their ERs like, you know, ever and ever, you know, rather than rolling the R's like a very standard American accent would have. And of course, you know, we know what we sound like. So it was a task, and it was fun. And it was fun to do something very different. Because action for me that's what I do. I don't really have to think that much about it. You know, of course, you got to train hard and be able to still be sharp and do it all. Dramatic roles or something involving a bit of comedy, that's a whole other scary sort of aspect for me. But it's been great, you know, and honestly, it's about the journey. You know, a lot of the movies I've done, you would term B-grade movies, they call them, but it's really not even relevant for me, because it's about the people I've met doing those things, the fact that I've traveled to so many different countries, still involving my passion, which is martial arts.
Yeah, you're very lucky that you can incorporate that into some, in another genre as well. Definitely.
Yeah, exactly. And not many people get to do that. I believe most people wake up and they do the 9 to 5 and they pretty much hate it. And all their future dream is when they retire and have enough money, and then they'll go on holidays and do all this sort of stuff. Well, I get to be like a big kid. You know, I get all these grown-up toys and I can beat people up and shoot them and everything. And you know, it doesn't get better than that. No,
it doesn't sound like it. Speaking of the 9 to 5 job, is there anything that you do besides the acting?
Well, I'm still very heavily involved in martial arts. I'm teaching a lot of seminars in Australia right now. We're doing them in Melbourne and Sydney and Canberra. You know, I'm actually got ones with the Australian Federal Police in Canberra, as well as martial arts schools.
What would you be teaching the police?
It's more, you know, what we call the startle flinch response. You know, it's a reaction to what we term the ambush in combat terms, meaning the sucker punch, you know, the time that somebody just hauls off and tries to knock your block off for no apparent reason. You know, in combat we have a thing called being switched on, where you perceive a threat, you're able to address it, you're able to decide whether you're going to run away, dissuade with dialogue, or you're going to get physical. And that's not as bad, because when that happens, you have a chance to work out a plan of attack and do what you do. Where most people get hurt, and a lot of the violence that even happening in Melbourne, it's from the sucker punch, meaning the punch out of the blue that nobody even is aware of and gets unprepared for. Aside from it, in the old days it used to be very much one-on-one. The rules have changed. As you know, a lot of these attacks are now 5 or 6 under 1. And the fight doesn't even start until the person hits the ground. So we're in a really dangerous phase as far as violence is concerned, and that's evident by the newspaper accounts of people with brain damage that basically have their lives changed forever. So what I work on is how to react naturally with what we call a primal move called the flinch response or startle response. That basically just you do this, you know. So
yours is a bit more of like, you know, a street fighting response to something, instead of, you know, them being in an arena and having, you know, things, you know.
Absolutely. We call that consensual sparring, you know. Even in UFC and mixed martial arts, it's consensual, because I know I'm going to fight you, there's a referee, there's rules. In the street, there are none. And, you know, the favourite saying is, the attacker decides when, where and how. Right? We don't. So you can be anywhere. You can be in a bar, in a party, in a street, in a dark alley. So what my job is to take the skills that a martial artist would have, but teach you how to deliver them from a whole different environment. As I say, just standing in a very relaxed stance and having to react, how to change what we call a startle flinch response into something tactical, and then deciding then whether it gets more physical or whether you have a chance to do enough to basically, you know, run the other way. The trouble with being a policeman is the same as when I was a bodyguard. You know, as I said, I did bodyguard work for 15 years with rock and roll bands like the Rolling Stones and Fleetwood Mac.
I'm going to stop you there, Richie, because I'd really like to explore that a little bit further. We're just going to quickly go to a break.
All right.
You're watching NatChat, and we'll be back after these messages.